Waiting, in its essence, is an exercise in patience that most of us find challenging. It's the gap between our desires and their fulfillment, a space where uncertainty reigns and frustration lurks. Whether we're anticipating a change in circumstance, an improvement in our lives, or a reversal of fortune, waiting tests our resolve like few other experiences can. But perhaps the most arduous form of waiting is the one that involves waiting on God. It's a spiritual waiting game where we relinquish control and place our hopes, dreams, and desires in the hands of a divine force. It's waiting for God's timing, which often feels elusive and inscrutable. It's a season where prayers seem unanswered, where pleas seem to echo in the void, and where doubts can creep in like shadows in the night. The paradox of waiting on God lies in the tension between our impatience and His sovereignty. We yearn for swift resolutions, immediate gratification, and clear signs of progress. Yet, God operates on a different timetable, one that is beyond our comprehension, yet perfectly orchestrated in His wisdom. In the tapestry of biblical narratives, waiting on the Lord is a recurring motif. From the Israelites wandering in the wilderness to Job enduring trials of unimaginable magnitude, the scriptures are replete with stories of waiting, perseverance, and eventual deliverance. These accounts serve as beacons of hope, reminding us that waiting is not synonymous with abandonment and that God's promises endure even in the darkest of hours. But how do we navigate the tumultuous waters of waiting on God? How do we find solace in the midst of uncertainty and strength in the face of adversity? The answer lies in cultivating a posture of faith, a steadfast belief that God is at work behind the scenes, orchestrating events according to His divine plan. Waiting on God requires surrender, a willingness to release our grip on the reins of control and entrust our lives to His care. It demands perseverance, a resolve to keep the faith, even when the storms rage and the skies grow dark. It beckons us to humility, to acknowledge our limitations and embrace our dependence on a power greater than ourselves. Yet, in the crucible of waiting, there is transformation. It is in the waiting that our character is refined, our faith is strengthened, and our hearts are softened. It is in the waiting that we learn to discern the whispers of God's voice amidst the clamor of the world. And it is in the waiting that we discover that His grace is sufficient, His love is unfailing, and His promises are true. So, as we journey through the seasons of waiting, let us not lose heart. Let us anchor our souls in the unshakable truth that God is faithful and His plans for us are good. And let us wait with eager anticipation, knowing that in the fullness of time, He will make all things beautiful in His perfect way. God's waiting room is a place of tension, where the rhythm of our lives clashes with the cadence of divine timing. It's a space where our urgency meets God's patience, where our desires intersect with His sovereign will. In this waiting room, the clock ticks at a different pace, a pace dictated not by our agendas or ambitions, but by the unfolding of God's purposes. For many, God's waiting room is a place of longing and anticipation. It's the season where we eagerly await the fulfillment of our aspirations, a diploma in hand, a partner by our side, a family to call our own, a venture launched, a deal sealed. It's the restless longing for the realization of our dreams, the achievement of our goals, the fulfillment of our deepest desires. Yet, in God's waiting room, time seems to stand still. Days blur into weeks, weeks into months, and months into years, as we wrestle with the tension between our impatience and God's perfect timing. We wonder why the doors remain closed, why the answers tarry, why the breakthroughs elude us. We question the silence of heaven, the seeming indifference of God, and the uncertainty of our own futures. But in the midst of the waiting, there is grace, for it is in the waiting room that we learn the art of surrender, the art of releasing our grip on the reins of control and trusting in God's unfailing wisdom. It is here that we discover the beauty of divine orchestration, the weaving together of circumstances, people, and events in ways we could never fathom. It is in the waiting room that we find solace in the assurance that God is at work, even when we cannot see or understand His ways. And so, we wait with hope, a hope that transcends our circumstances, our doubts, and our fears. We wait with faith, a faith that anchors us in the unshakable truth of God's promises. We wait with expectancy, an expectancy that dares to believe that beyond the waiting lies the fulfillment of God's plans and purposes for our lives. So, if you find yourself in God's waiting room today, take heart. Know that you are not alone. Know that this season of waiting is not in vain. For in the waiting room, God is shaping you, refining you, preparing you for the extraordinary journey that lies ahead. And when the time is right, when the appointed moment arrives, you will step out of the waiting room and into the fullness of God's blessings, knowing that every moment of waiting was worth the wait. Many of us have found ourselves in the uncomfortable position of waiting on God, feeling the pressure of our own timelines pressing against the perceived silence of the divine. It's a scenario where our desires are urgent, our prayers fervent, and our expectations high. Yet, despite our certainty in God's faithfulness and our conviction in His will, the waiting room of life can feel suffocating, the silence deafening, and the delay interminable. In those moments of impatience, when our hearts cry out for answers and our souls yearn for resolution, it's easy to question God's timing. We wonder why He seems to linger while we are ready to move forward. We question His presence amidst the uncertainty, His intentions amidst the confusion, and His goodness amidst the waiting. But in the midst of our impatience, there lies a profound truth. God's timing is not bound by our human constraints. His ways are higher, His thoughts deeper, and His plans more intricate than we could ever comprehend. While we may be confined to the limitations of time and space, God operates beyond them, orchestrating the events of our lives with divine precision and purpose. And so, as we find ourselves in the waiting room of life, we are called to trust in God's sovereignty, His wisdom, and His unfailing love. We are called to surrender our timelines, our agendas, and our desires at the altar of His perfect will. We are called to embrace the tension between our impatience and His patience, knowing that His timing is always impeccable, His purposes always redemptive, and His promises always true. In the waiting room, we are invited to draw near to God, to lean into His presence, and to seek His face amidst the uncertainty. It is here, in the quiet moments of waiting, that we discover the depth of our faith, the strength of our resilience, and the beauty of His grace. And it is here, in the waiting room, that we learn to walk by faith, not by sight, to trust in the God who is faithful, even when the answers tarry and the breakthroughs delay. So if you find yourself in the waiting room of life today, take heart. Know that you are not alone. Know that God sees you, hears you, and holds you in the palm of His hand. And know that His timing, though mysterious and often beyond our understanding, is always perfect. For in the waiting room, God is at work, shaping, refining, and preparing us for the extraordinary journey that lies ahead. And when the time is right, when the appointed moment arrives, we will step out of the waiting room and into the fullness of God's blessings, knowing that every moment of waiting was worth the wait. In the waiting rooms of life, where time seems to linger and answers are elusive, we are invited into a profound journey of trust, a journey where our faith is tested, our character refined, and our hearts transformed. It's in these sacred spaces of waiting that God molds us, shapes us, and prepares us for the extraordinary plans He has in store. In the crucible of waiting, we discover the essence of faith, the unwavering belief that God is at work, even when the evidence seems scarce and the road ahead uncertain. For without faith, it is impossible to please God. And so, in the waiting rooms of life, our faith is both tested and strengthened. Yet, it's not merely about the destination. It's about the journey. While we strive towards our goals, pursue our dreams, and labor towards our visions, God is at work within us, shaping our character, molding our hearts, and refining our spirits. For He is more interested in who we are becoming than in what we are achieving. Sometimes, in the midst of our impatience, we may feel as though God is withholding His blessings, delaying His answers, or ignoring our prayers. Yet in reality, He is simply waiting for us to be ready to receive, to be ready to steward His blessings, and to be ready to walk in the fullness of His purpose for our lives. And so, in the waiting rooms of life, God invites us to surrender our timelines, our agendas, and our desires at the altar of His perfect will. He invites us to embrace the process, to trust in His timing, and to allow Him to work deeply within us, shaping us into vessels of His grace and instruments of His love. For the blessings God intends to bestow upon us are far greater than we can imagine, but they require hearts that are ready, spirits that are willing, and faith that is unwavering. And so, as we journey through the waiting rooms of life, let us hold fast to the promise that God is faithful, His plans are perfect, and His love endures forever. And in His perfect time, the answers will come, the blessings will overflow, and the dreams will be fulfilled, all to the glory of His name. Understanding the difference between a delay and a denial is a crucial lesson in life, a distinction that separates maturity from immaturity. For immature children, a delay often feels like a denial. They lack the perspective to see beyond the immediate moment, and so a postponed desire can lead to tears, tantrums, and frustration. Yet, in the grand scheme of God's plan, a delay is not a denial. It's a divine invitation to growth, maturity, and readiness. God sees the bigger picture, the intricate details of our lives, and He knows the perfect timing for His purposes to unfold. In the waiting room of God's timing, however, we are susceptible to a myriad of negative emotions. Worry, stress, anxiety, and envy can cloud our vision, distort our perspective, and rob us of the peace that surpasses understanding. We compare our journeys to those around us, measuring our progress against their successes, and falling prey to the insidious trap of comparison. In the midst of waiting, frustration can mount, and self-pity can rear its ugly head. We question God's goodness, His faithfulness, and His promises, wondering why He seems silent amidst our struggles and indifferent to our pleas. But in the midst of the storm of emotions, there lies a beacon of hope, a reminder that God's timing is perfect, His ways are higher, and His love is unfailing. It's a call to surrender, to release our grip on control, to trust in His sovereignty, and to embrace the journey, however long or winding it may be. For in the waiting, there is transformation. In the waiting, our faith is tested, our character is refined, and our hearts are expanded to receive the fullness of God's blessings. And in the waiting, we learn to fix our eyes not on the temporal circumstances, but on the eternal promises of God. So, if you find yourself in God's waiting room today, take heart. Know that you are not alone. Know that God is at work in the waiting, shaping, molding, and preparing you for the extraordinary journey ahead. And know that His delays are not denials but divine appointments for growth, maturity, and readiness. Trust in His timing, lean on His grace, and let His peace reign in your heart, knowing that He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. When you find yourself in the waiting room of life, there are profound lessons and actions that God desires from you. It's important to understand that waiting is not merely a passive experience, but an active journey of faith and growth. First and foremost, God calls us to trust Him in the waiting, Trust is the bedrock of our relationship with God, and it's in the waiting room that our trust is refined and deepened. We are called to trust in His wisdom, His timing, and His unfailing love, even when the answers seem distant and the road ahead uncertain. Secondly, God wants us to embrace the process of waiting as a time of growth and maturity. It's not merely about receiving what we desire when we desire it, but about becoming the kind of people who can steward God's blessings with wisdom, humility, and integrity. The delays we encounter are by design. They are opportunities for us to cultivate patience, perseverance, and character. As parents understand the distinction between no and not yet when guiding their children, so too does God distinguish between denying our requests and delaying their fulfillment. He knows the perfect timing for every prayer, every dream, and every vision we hold dear. And in His infinite wisdom, He orchestrates the delays to align with His greater purposes for our lives. Throughout the Scriptures, we see countless examples of individuals who experience seasons of waiting: Abraham, Joseph, Moses, David, and many others. Their stories remind us that God's delays are not denials, but divine appointments for growth, transformation, and ultimately, fulfillment. So, as you navigate the waiting rooms of life, remember that God is not a vending machine, dispensing instant answers to our prayers. Instead, He invites us into a journey of faith, a journey marked by trust, patience, and surrender. And in the waiting, may we find the strength to persevere, the courage to hope, and the faith to believe that His promises will be fulfilled in His perfect time. The stories of Noah, Abraham, Moses, and Joseph exemplify the profound truth that God's timing is not bound by human understanding. In each of these narratives, we witness the interplay between divine promise and human patience, between God's faithfulness and the waiting required of His servants. Noah's obedience in building the ark stands as a testament to his unwavering trust in God's word, even in the face of incredulity and mockery. For 120 years, he diligently labored on the ark, trusting in God's promise of deliverance despite the absence of rain. And when the flood waters finally came, Noah and his family found refuge and salvation in the vessel God had instructed him to build. Abraham's journey of faith is marked by years of waiting and uncertainty. God's promise of a great nation seemed improbable as he and Sarah advanced in age without the birth of a child. Yet, in their old age, Isaac was born, fulfilling God's covenant and ushering in the fulfillment of His promise. Moses, called to lead the Israelites out of slavery, endured years of preparation and waiting in the wilderness before the appointed time arrived. His exile, though seemingly a delay, was instrumental in shaping him into the leader God intended him to be. Through trials and tribulations, Moses learned dependence on God's guidance and provision, ultimately leading the Israelites to freedom. Joseph's journey from slavery to prominence is a testament to God's sovereignty amidst adversity. Despite facing betrayal, false accusations, and imprisonment, Joseph remained steadfast in his faith, trusting in God's providence even in the darkest of times. And in due course, God elevated him to a position of authority, fulfilling the dreams and promises bestowed upon him. These stories remind us that God's timing is perfect, His promises are sure, and His faithfulness endures through every trial and tribulation. In the waiting, we are called to trust, to persevere, and to remain faithful to the One who holds the universe in His hands. For in His time, every promise will be fulfilled, every prayer answered, and every dream realized according to His perfect plan and purpose. The narratives of King David and Jesus Christ underscore the profound truth that delays are not denials in the economy of God's plans. David, anointed as king in his youth, faced years of trials and tribulations before ascending to the throne. Similarly, Jesus Christ spent 3 decades in obscurity before beginning his earthly ministry, a period of waiting and preparation that was essential to his divine mission. In times of delay, it's natural to wrestle with feelings of abandonment and forgottenness. The psalmist's lament in Psalm 13 echoes the sentiments of many who have felt the weight of waiting. "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" The human heart, prone to doubt and fear, can often question God's presence and his concern for our circumstances. Yet, amidst the doubts and uncertainties, we are reminded of God's unchanging character and his steadfast love. The psalmist's cry in Psalm 10 reflects the raw honesty of human emotion in the face of adversity. "Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble?" These questions resonate with those who have felt abandoned in their trials. But even in the midst of our doubts, we are reassured of God's unfailing care and attention. Our names are etched on the palms of his hands, a symbol of his intimate knowledge of us and his unwavering commitment to our well-being. In the storms of life, we may feel forgotten, but God's love remains constant, his presence unwavering. God's timing, though often different from our own, is never a reflection of his lack of love or concern. When prayers seem unanswered and needs unmet, it's easy to question God's goodness and his faithfulness. Yet, his ways are higher, his plans more intricate than we can comprehend. In the waiting, we are called to trust in God's perfect timing, his perfect love, and his perfect plan for our lives. Though disappointment may cloud our vision, we are reminded that God's love for us surpasses understanding. He hears our prayers, he sees our needs, and he will answer in his time according to his will. So, when faced with delays and disappointments, let us cling to the truth that God loves us beyond measure. His delays are not denials, but divine appointments for growth, transformation, and ultimately, fulfillment. In his perfect love, we find hope, strength, and assurance that he who began a good work in us will bring it to completion. In the darkest moments of life, it's as if Jesus himself is speaking to us, cutting through our fear and uncertainty, and whispering, "Trust me, I am right here." While God's timing may not always align with our expectations, we can find solace in trusting the one who orchestrates time itself. Trusting God's timing can be challenging because it requires relinquishing control, a surrendering of our own agendas and desires to his sovereign will. We prefer our own timing because it gives us a sense of control over our lives. Yet, as parents recognize in their children, impatience often leads to frustration and missed blessings. Trusting God's timing offers peace, rest, and the removal of disappointment and bitterness from our hearts. While it might seem logical for God to reveal all the details of our lives in advance, his wisdom lies in inviting us to live one day at a time, trusting in his goodness and love. In Acts 1:7, Jesus reminds us that the timing of events is in the Father's hands. We may not always understand why God chooses certain timings, but we can trust that his timing is perfect because he knows all things, past, present, and future. Waiting upon God's timing requires faith, a willingness to trust him even when the details are unclear and the answers seem distant. It's about believing that his timing is better than ours and that he desires only what is best for us. Trusting God means we stop trying to force things to happen according to our own timeline and instead wait patiently for his guidance and provision. It's a painful process, but it leads to double blessings for our former troubles. Ultimately, trusting God is not about getting what we want when we want it. It's about believing that when the timing is right, God will provide what we need according to his perfect plan. It's about surrendering to his will and resting in the assurance that he is faithful to fulfill his promises in his time and in his way. In life, Wounds do mend, bodies do heal, and disappointment can turn into new dreams. The end of one chapter often signals the beginning of something new, especially when we put our trust in God. If you're still here on this planet, it's because God has a plan for you. Even when it feels like God has forgotten about you, He hasn't. He hears your cries, sees your struggles, and knows your heart intimately. You are not invisible to Him. God knows precisely where you are and what you're going through. He understands your limits and your capacity to endure. While His timing may not always align with our expectations, it's always perfect. He may not be early, but He will never be late. Trusting in God's timing requires faith in His goodness and His intentions toward us. It's a belief that He has our best interests at heart and that His plans for us are for our welfare, not for harm. Some may argue that they don't have time to waste, but waiting on God is never a waste of time. In fact, it's in the waiting that we often discover His timing is always the right time. It's in the waiting that we learn patience, perseverance, and trust. So, if you find yourself in a season of waiting, take heart. God sees you, hears you, and knows exactly what you need. Trust in His timing, for His plans for you are always good, and His timing is always perfect.